Well, Washington has seen a flurry of activity as Canadian government and business leaders rush to make their case that Americans would also suffer if the Trump administration goes ahead with hefty tariffs next month. John Bolton was Donald Trump's former national security advisor during his first term, U.S. ambassador as well to the UN under President George W. Bush. Ambassador Bolton joins me live now. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you making the time.
Glad to be with you.
Well, Canada's premiers were in Washington yesterday, meeting with people in the orbit of Donald Trump. Our finance minister, Dominic LeBlanc, met with Howard Lutnick. Canadian officials say that they're confident they have the attention of the White House when it comes to tariffs. But please give us a reality check, because you know Donald Trump. You know how he works. Will Canadian diplomacy make a difference here?
Well, it's certainly worth the effort, but whatever conversations they had with people in the administration is no guarantee of what Trump himself will decide, since he often makes up his mind based on the views of the last person he talked to. But nobody should blink at the idea that he's very, very enamored of tariffs. He thinks he has the authority to change them unilaterally. That will be subject to litigation. And so far, he's been impervious to arguments that tariffs are really a hidden tax on American consumers. He thinks, in the case of Canada, that Canadians will pay the tariffs he's imposing, not recognizing that it's actually the American importer that pays the tariff first, and then American consumers. So I think it's going to take a real effort. I think it's just a matter of personalities as so much as with Trump. He doesn't like Prime Minister Trudeau. He seems more impressed by Mexican President Sheinbaum. Don't ask me to explain why. But I think from Canada's perspective, there's still an awful lot of work to do.
As you mentioned there, Trump does not like Prime Minister Trudeau. We have somewhat of a leadership vacuum in Ottawa. Do you think a new Canadian government would change any of that?
Well, it's possible. But, you know, as Trump kind of stumbles around saying Canada is going to become the 51st state and calling the Prime Minister Governor Trudeau, it obviously provokes a backlash, understandably. And I think Trump could inadvertently be giving advantage to whoever might succeed Trudeau as the head of his party. So it's a real conundrum for the Conservatives in Canada as to how to perform here. It's utterly irrelevant to Trump.
You were part of an administration that imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada in 2018, predicated on national security. Canada now faces 3 separate tariff threats from the U.S., the possibility of reciprocal tariffs even being announced today from the Trump administration. I just wonder what you think the best course of action is for Canada in terms of retaliation. Is dollar-for-dollar tariffs, counter tariffs, the way to go for Canada?
But just for the record, the steel and aluminum tariffs were enacted about a month before I arrived. Not that I could have changed it if I had been there necessarily, but I don't think there's much of an alternative. Although I would not to responding to the U.S. tariffs. Although I wouldn't necessarily say they should be completely symmetrical. I think there are other steps that could be taken. You know, when people look at trade wars historically. It's hard to see that anybody emerges, although the larger economy, just by dint of its size, tends to do a little bit better. So that puts Canada at a disadvantage. And I think that the best way to proceed might also be to redirect Trump's attention. The real problem in international trade today is China, which is dumping large quantities of steel and aluminum and distorting the international trading system in a variety of ways, including stealing everybody else's intellectual property. A sensible approach to the problems of international trade is to focus on the country causing the problems and unite others against it. And I do think within the U.S. there's broad bipartisan concern about China in Congress. So that may be one way to say, look, we've got our differences on trade. Trading partners always have issues on trade. Let's resolve them like adults, and let's focus instead on where the real threat to our economic well-being lies, and that's with China's unfair trade practices.
In your estimation, then, what is it that Trump wants from Canada?
I think he wants somebody to kiss his ring so he can declare victory. He can say, boy, I threatened them and they gave in. You know, Ronald Reagan had a saying that there's no limit to how much you can accomplish in Washington as long as you're willing to let somebody else take the credit. So Canada might want to consider a deal where nothing much changes. That's what happened a couple of weeks ago when Trump first imposed the tariffs. There really was no significant change. Just as long as you don't mind Trump saying, "Well, I beat the Canadians into the ground again," it may end up not damaging either Canada's economy or the U.S. economy.
All right, Ambassador Bolton, I have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you making time for the conversation.
Thanks for having me.